Imagine a man. Call him Robert. It's 1978. He's 42 years old, working at a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio. He's been there for 19 years. He knows the names of everyone on his floor. He knows the shift supervisors, the plant manager, the woman who runs the cafeteria on Tuesdays. Robert is not wealthy. He never was. But he is. By every measure, he was raised to understand, doing the right things. He shows up. He stays loyal. He contributes to his pension. He doesn't ask questions the system wasn't designed to answer. And when his younger colleagues ask him about retirement, he gives them the same answer his father gave him: keep your head down. Do your job. The company takes care of the rest. He believes this. Not blindly, not naively. He believes it because for almost 2 decades, it has been true. The pension statement arrives every year. The numbers grow. The math, as far as he can tell, works. Robert is not a cautionary tale about irresponsibility. He is a cautionary tale about something far more unsettling. He trusted a system that was, at that very moment, beginning to change underneath him. And he had no way of knowing. To understand what happened to Robert's generation, you have to understand what pensions actually represented. Not financially. Psychologically, after World War II, the United States and much of the Western world entered an era of extraordinary economic confidence. Factories were running, unions were strong, large corporations were building permanent workforces. The relationship between an employer and an employee was designed to last decades. In that environment, the defined benefit pension emerged as the cornerstone of a social contract. The structure was elegant in its simplicity. You work for us for 30 years. We invest on your behalf. When you retire, we pay you a predictable monthly income for the rest of your life. The risk, critically, belonged to the institution, not to you. The company made the contributions. The company managed the investments. The company absorbed the uncertainty. The employee simply had to show up, year after year, and trust that the system would honor its end of the arrangement. By the 1950s and 1960s, this model had become deeply woven into the American identity. Retirement wasn't a financial strategy. It was a social destination, something you arrived at after decades of contribution. A reward embedded in the culture of work itself. For millions of people, particularly those who had lived through the Depression and the war, the pension was the first time in history that ordinary working people had been offered a genuine promise about their future. And for a long time, it was a promise that held. This is the part that history tends to skip over. When we look back at pensions today, there is a temptation to frame the people who trusted them as somehow naive, as though the warning signs were obvious, as though anyone paying attention should have seen what was coming. That framing is wrong. For the first several decades of the post-war era, the pension system delivered. Millions of workers retired with stable incomes. Millions of families were protected from poverty and old age. The system, in many ways, functioned exactly as promised. The trust was not irrational. It was earned. And more than that, it was reinforced by everything the culture communicated. Television showed retirement as a comfortable finish line. Companies advertised loyalty as mutual. Financial institutions rarely challenged the dominant narrative. If you were Robert in 1978, looking backward at your life, you would see evidence that the system worked. You would see your father's generation retire. You would see your neighbors live out their later years with dignity. You would see your own pension statement growing reliably, year after year. The psychological principle at work here is called system justification. When a system consistently produces positive outcomes for the people around us, we internalize it as trustworthy. We don't just follow the rules, we believe in them. And in this case, that belief wasn't unreasonable. It just wasn't permanent. The changes didn't announce themselves. They rarely do. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a quiet series of economic pressures began accumulating beneath the surface of the retirement system. The first was demographic. Life expectancy was rising faster than actuaries had modeled. People were living longer, sometimes significantly longer. A pension designed to pay benefits for 8 years was suddenly paying for 15, 20, 25. The second was corporate. Globalization was intensifying. Competition was increasing. Companies that had spent decades building loyal, permanent workforces were now facing pressure to cut costs, restructure operations, and prioritize short-term profitability over long-term obligations. The third was legislative. In 1978, a relatively obscure provision of the tax code was quietly passed. Section 401k. At the time, it was barely noticed by the public. Within a decade, it would fundamentally alter the architecture of American retirement. Each of these shifts, taken individually, might have been manageable. Together, they created a transformation that most ordinary workers had no framework to understand, because nobody told them the rules were changing. This is perhaps the most important part of this story, and it is the part that almost no one talks about directly. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American corporations began a quiet but systematic migration away from defined benefit pension plans toward defined contribution plans, most commonly the 401k. On the surface, this looked like modernization, flexibility, employee empowerment. In reality, something more fundamental was happening. The risk was moving. Under a defined benefit pension, the employer carries the investment risk. If markets underperform, the company makes up the shortfall. The employee receives the promised amount regardless. Under a defined contribution plan, the employee carries the investment risk. If markets underperform, the employee absorbs the loss. The company's obligation ends the moment its contribution is made. Between 1980 and 2006, the percentage of private sector workers covered by traditional pensions fell from roughly 38% to under 20%. Tens of millions of people transitioned from a system where institutions carried their retirement risk to a system where they carried it themselves. This was not announced. There was no national conversation. There was no moment where working Americans were gathered together and clearly told, the rules have changed. The burden is now yours. It happened gradually, through corporate memos, benefit plan restructurings, and the quiet language of financial product marketing that made self-directed investing sound like liberation rather than responsibility. And for many people, particularly those already in their 40s and 50s at the time, there was simply not enough runway left to adapt. Numbers can describe what happened to retirement savings. They cannot describe what it feels like to be 62 years old and realize that the certainty you built your life around was not as solid as you believed. There is a specific kind of psychological injury that occurs not when people are deceived outright, but when the assumptions underneath their life quietly erode. Researchers call it expectation violation, the gap between what we believed would happen and what actually occurs. For Robert's generation, the injury was not always financial catastrophe. Sometimes it was subtler than that. It was the pension that paid less than expected because the company restructured just before the vesting cliff. It was the 401k that was devastated by the 2008 financial crisis at precisely the moment retirement was 5 years away. It was the medical costs that no one had modeled. It was the slow realization that the math, which had once felt settled, was suddenly dependent on variables no one had warned them to consider. And underneath all of that was something harder to name. A sense that they had kept their end of the bargain. And the bargain had quietly been renegotiated without their knowledge. Each successive generation inherited a slightly different version of the retirement promise. Baby boomers, particularly those born in the earlier part of that generation, experienced something close to the original system. Many benefited from defined benefit pensions. Many retired with genuine stability. Their experience largely confirmed the narrative they had been given. Generation X arrived to find a mixed landscape. Some had access to pensions, many did not. The 401k was becoming dominant. The message had shifted from your employer will provide to you are responsible for building your own security. But this message arrived without sufficient education, without adequate default saving structures, and without the cultural infrastructure needed to support it. Millennials entered a workforce where defined benefit pensions had become a rarity in the private sector. The responsibility was almost entirely individual from the beginning, but wages had stagnated, housing costs had soared, and student debt had become a structural weight that compressed the ability to save during the most mathematically powerful years of compounding. Each generation received a different map, and none of them were told the map had changed. It would be dishonest to tell only one side of this story. Many pensions still function. Public sector defined benefit plans continue to cover teachers, firefighters, police officers, and government employees across the country. Many of those workers will retire with genuine income stability. Many people using 401ks and individual retirement accounts have built meaningful wealth over time. The tools, used thoughtfully over long horizons, can be genuinely powerful. Retirement systems in many countries have evolved carefully, incorporating automatic enrollment, diversified fund structures, and employer matching designs that have measurably improved outcomes for ordinary workers. And the original pension system, as stable as it felt, was not without its own vulnerabilities. Underfunded plans, corporate bankruptcies, municipal insolvencies. The promise of a defined benefit pension was sometimes only as strong as the institution behind it. The story is not that the old system was perfect and everything that followed was broken. The story is that the transition between systems happened without the transparency, the education, or the time that people needed to adapt. That distinction matters. Robert retired in 1999. It was better than some outcomes, worse than others. The pension was smaller than he had imagined. The medical costs were larger. The certainty he had carried for decades had been replaced by a quieter, more anxious arithmetic that he was never quite prepared to run. He didn't make catastrophic mistakes. He didn't ignore the system. He did, as far as he understood it, everything he was supposed to do. What changed was not Robert. What changed was the world around him. The rules that governed it. The institutions that had made him a promise when the economic conditions for keeping that promise still existed. The deepest loss of his generation was not always financial. It was the loss of a particular kind of certainty. The certainty that comes from trusting a system completely, from believing that if you follow the path leads where you were told it would. That certainty, once lost, is very difficult to reconstruct. Because what you lose is not just the destination. You lose faith in the map itself. And when an entire generation loses faith in the map, the question that remains is not whether they should have paid closer attention. The question is why the map changed without anyone telling them. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, subscribe. This channel exists to investigate the forces that shape financial life in ways most people never see. Share this with someone navigating retirement uncertainty right now, because sometimes the most valuable thing is finally feeling like someone understood the question.